The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty airfield as Captain Marcus Riley performed his final pre-flight check on the military helicopter. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades from other aircraft filled the air, creating a symphony of mechanical precision that had become the soundtrack of his life over the past 15 years. At 42, Marcus had logged more flight hours than most pilots could dream of. But today felt different. There was tension in the air that went beyond the usual pre-mission nerves. The briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence suggested that a group of insurgents had established a weapons cache in a remote mountain village, approximately 60 miles northeast of their base. The mission was simple: transport a team of Special Forces operatives to the location, provide air support during the raid, and extract the team once the objective was complete. Marcus had flown dozens of similar missions, but something about the intelligence report nagged at him. The enemy seemed too organized, too well informed about military movements in the region. As he walked around the aircraft, checking every bolt and wire, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. His helicopter, a battle-tested machine that had served him faithfully through countless missions, gleamed in the morning light. The crew chief, Sergeant Tommy Chen, was busy loading ammunition and checking the weapon systems. Tommy had been Marcus's right-hand man for 3 years, and their partnership had saved lives on more than one occasion. The Special Forces team began boarding the helicopter, their faces painted with camouflage and their equipment checked and rechecked. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, the team leader, approached Marcus with a confident stride that barely concealed her own concerns about the mission. She had reviewed the same intelligence reports and shared Marcus's unease about the operation. "Weather looks good for the flight," she said, though both of them knew the conversation was really about something else entirely. "Intelligence says we should have clear skies and minimal resistance." Marcus nodded, but his eyes remained focused on the horizon. Years of combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The enemy had been unusually quiet for the past 2 weeks, which in his experience usually meant they were planning something big. The flight to the target area was uneventful, the helicopter cutting through the crisp morning air with mechanical precision. Below them, the landscape changed from flat desert to rolling hills and finally to the rugged mountain terrain where their objective waited. The village appeared peaceful from the air, with no visible signs of military activity or unusual movement. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, and children could be seen playing in the dusty streets. As they approached the landing zone, Marcus felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with every combat mission. The team would fast rope down, while he maintained a hover pattern, providing cover and ready extraction if things went wrong. It was a maneuver they had practiced hundreds of times, but in combat, even the most routine operations could turn deadly in seconds. The helicopter descended toward the predetermined landing zone, a small clearing on the outskirts of the village. Marcus could see Lieutenant Martinez and her team preparing their gear, checking weapons one final time, and reviewing hand signals they would use to communicate during the operation. The plan called for them to be on the ground for no more than 30 minutes, just long enough to secure the weapons cache and gather any intelligence materials they could find. As the aircraft settled into its hover pattern, the team began their descent on thick ropes. Marcus kept his eyes moving, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of threat. The village remained quiet, almost too quiet for a place that should have been bustling with morning activity. Where were the people? Why had the streets suddenly emptied of the children who had been playing just minutes before? The first 3 team members reached the ground safely and immediately took defensive positions around the landing zone. Lieutenant Martinez was next, followed by the team's explosives expert and communications specialist. Everything was proceeding according to plan when Marcus noticed movement in the buildings surrounding the clearing. It was subtle at first, just shadows shifting behind windows and doorways, but his trained eye caught the telltale signs of an ambush being set up. "Contact front!" The radio crackled with Lieutenant Martinez's voice just as the first shots rang out from multiple positions around the village. Muzzle flashes erupted from rooftops and windows as what appeared to be a much larger force than anticipated opened fire on the team. The intelligence had been wrong, or worse, they had been deliberately fed false information. Marcus immediately began evasive maneuvers, the helicopter dancing through the air as bullets whistled past the cockpit. Sergeant Chen returned fire with the door-mounted machine gun, his tracers streaking toward the enemy positions. The team on the ground had taken cover behind a low stone wall, but they were clearly outnumbered and outgunned. "We need immediate extraction." Martinez's voice was calm but urgent over the radio. "We've got at least 40 hostiles in fortified positions. This isn't a weapons cache, it's a damn fortress." Marcus brought the helicopter lower, trying to provide cover for his trapped team while staying mobile enough to avoid the increasing volume of enemy fire. The aircraft shuddered as several rounds found their mark, but nothing critical was hit. He could see the team fighting desperately to reach the extraction point, moving by bounds from cover to cover while laying down suppressive fire. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What should have been a simple raid had turned into a full-scale battle. And Marcus found himself in the position he dreaded most, having to choose between his aircraft and his team. The enemy fire was becoming more accurate, and he could see rocket-propelled grenades being moved into position. In moments, the situation would become completely untenable. As he maneuvered the helicopter for another strafing run, Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He would risk everything to get his people out, even if it meant flying directly into the teeth of the enemy's defenses. The helicopter lurched forward through a hail of bullets, heading straight for the landing zone where his team was fighting for their lives. The helicopter shook violently as enemy fire concentrated on the aircraft. Marcus could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing through the rotor blades and the metallic ping of rounds striking the fuselage. Through the chaos, he maintained his focus on the team below, who were desperately trying to reach the extraction point while under heavy fire from multiple directions. Lieutenant Martinez and her team had managed to advance about 50 yards from their initial position, but progress was slow and costly. The enemy had clearly prepared for this moment, with overlapping fields of fire and well-positioned snipers making every movement dangerous. Sergeant Thompson, the team's medic, had already taken a bullet in the shoulder but continued to provide covering fire for his teammates. "Marcus, we're taking too much heat," Sergeant Chen shouted over the noise of the engine and incoming fire. A row of bullet holes had appeared across the windscreen, spider-webbing the armored glass, but not yet penetrating completely. "The hydraulics are starting to get sluggish. We need to get out of here." But Marcus knew that leaving wasn't an option. Below them, 6 soldiers were trapped and fighting for their lives. The enemy had used the weapons cache story as bait, drawing them into a carefully planned ambush. The number of fighters had grown from the initial 40 to what looked like nearly 100, emerging from hidden positions throughout the village. As Marcus brought the helicopter around for another pass, he saw something that made his blood run cold. 3 enemy fighters were setting up a heavy machine gun on the roof of the tallest building in the village. From that position, they would have a clear field of fire over the entire landing zone, making extraction impossible. "Chen, take out that machine gun position on the big building," Marcus called out, banking the helicopter to give his crew chief a better angle. Tommy Chen swiveled the door gun toward the target and opened fire, his tracers walking across the rooftop. 2 of the enemy fighters went down immediately, but the third managed to get behind cover and continued setting up the weapon. The brief respite allowed Lieutenant Martinez's team to advance another 20 yards, but they were still pinned down and running low on ammunition. The helicopter lurched suddenly to the left as something heavy struck the tail rotor assembly. Marcus fought with the controls, feeling the aircraft's stability deteriorate rapidly. Warning lights began flashing across the instrument panel, and the familiar whine of the engines changed to a more labored sound that every pilot dreads. "We've got damage to the tail rotor," Marcus announced, his hands working frantically to compensate for the helicopter's tendency to spin. "I don't know how long I can keep her stable." On the ground, the situation was becoming desperate. The team's communications specialist, Corporal Williams, had been hit in the leg and was being dragged to cover by his teammates. They were now down to 4 effective fighters, facing overwhelming odds with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. Marcus made a split-second decision that went against every rule in the pilot's manual. Instead of climbing to a safer altitude, he brought the damaged helicopter lower, using the aircraft itself as a shield for his trapped team. The enemy fire immediately shifted to the helicopter, giving the ground team a moment to reorganize and plan their next move. The helicopter's engines were screaming now, pushed beyond their normal limits as Marcus fought to maintain control. Sergeant Chen continued firing from the door gun, but ammunition was running low and the weapon was beginning to overheat from continuous use. Through the damaged windscreen, Marcus could see more enemy fighters moving into position, including what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade team. RPG. 2 o'clock, Chen shouted, just as the rocket streaked across the sky, missing the helicopter by less than 10 feet. The explosion showered the aircraft with debris and created a cloud of dust that temporarily obscured the battlefield. Using the cover provided by the dust cloud, Lieutenant Martinez led her team in a desperate sprint toward the extraction point. They covered nearly 30 yards before the enemy realized what was happening and resumed firing. Corporal Jackson, the team's demolitions expert, stopped suddenly and spun around, clutching his chest. He had taken a direct hit, but managed to stay on his feet long enough to throw a grenade toward the nearest enemy position before collapsing. Marcus watched in horror as one of his soldiers fell, but there was nothing he could do except continue, providing what cover he could with his crippled aircraft. The helicopter was becoming increasingly difficult to control, and he knew they had minutes at most before mechanical failure would force them down. "Martinez, you need to move now," Marcus called over the radio. "I can't hold this position much longer." The remaining team members reached the extraction point just as another RPG streaked toward the helicopter. This time, Marcus couldn't avoid it. The rocket struck the aircraft's main rotor assembly, sending shrapnel flying in all directions and causing a catastrophic failure in the helicopter's primary flight systems. The helicopter began spinning violently. As it lost lift, the damaged rotor blades creating a deadly whirlwind of metal fragments. Marcus fought with the controls, trying to auto-rotate the aircraft to a survivable crash landing, but the damage was too extensive. The helicopter was coming down hard, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. In those final seconds before impact, Marcus saw Lieutenant Martinez and her surviving team members diving for cover as the helicopter spun toward the ground. Sergeant Chen was thrown against the doorframe as the aircraft rolled, his machine gun torn from its mount and sent tumbling across the landing zone. The helicopter hit the ground with tremendous force, the impact driving the skids deep into the rocky soil and collapsing the landing gear. The main rotor struck the ground and disintegrated, sending pieces of metal flying like deadly missiles. The fuel tanks ruptured on impact, creating a spreading pool of aviation fuel that mixed with the dust and debris. For a moment there was silence. Then the enemy fire resumed, now focused on the crash site where Marcus and his crew were trapped in the wreckage of their aircraft. Through the smoke and dust, he could see enemy fighters advancing on their position, weapons raised, and ready to finish what they had started. Marcus regained consciousness to the sound of gunfire and the acrid smell of burning aviation fuel. His head throbbed from the impact, and blood dripped from a gash above his right eye, but he was alive. The helicopter lay on its side, the cockpit, partially crushed but still providing some protection from the enemy fire that was now concentrated on their position. Chen, you okay?" Marcus called out, trying to locate his crew chief in the wreckage. A groan from somewhere behind him indicated that Tommy was alive, though possibly injured. The door gun had been completely destroyed in the crash, along with most of their defensive capabilities. Marcus unbuckled his harness and crawled toward the back of the aircraft, his body protesting every movement. His left shoulder felt dislocated, and something was definitely wrong with his ribs, but adrenaline was keeping the worst of the pain at bay. He found Sergeant Chen pinned under a piece of twisted metal, conscious but trapped. "My leg's caught," Chen said through gritted teeth. "Think it might be broken, but I can still fight if you can get me out of here." Outside the wreckage, Marcus could hear enemy fighters calling to each other in their native language. Coordinating their approach on the crash site, Lieutenant Martinez and her remaining team members were still alive and fighting, their rifle fire providing some deterrent to the advancing enemy, but they were heavily outnumbered and running critically low on ammunition. Marcus grabbed his sidearm from its holster and checked the magazine. 15 rounds plus 1 in the chamber. Not much against nearly 100 enemy fighters, but it would have to do. He also retrieved Chen's pistol and a survival knife from the emergency kit. If they were going to die here, they would at least make the enemy pay for it. Working quickly, Marcus managed to free Chen from the wreckage by using a piece of debris as a lever. The sergeant's leg was definitely broken, but he could still move and shoot. Together, they established a defensive position using the helicopter's wreckage as cover, with clear fields of fire toward the most likely enemy approach routes. The first enemy fighters appeared around the edge of a building about 50 yards away, moving cautiously but confidently toward the crash site. Marcus waited until they were close enough to make every shot count, then opened fire. His first 3 shots dropped 2 fighters and sent the others scrambling for cover. "Nice shooting," Chen commented, despite his obvious pain. He had propped himself against a piece of the helicopter's armor plating and was covering a different approach angle. "But we're going to run out of bullets long before they run out of people." Lieutenant Martinez's voice crackled over the radio, which had somehow survived the crash. "Marcus, we're down to our last magazines. Jackson's dead and Williams is bleeding out. We can't hold this position much longer." Marcus surveyed their situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 15 years of combat. They were surrounded, outgunned, low on ammunition, and had at least 2 seriously wounded men. By all military logic, this should have been the end of their story, but Marcus Riley had never been one to accept defeat, no matter how inevitable it seemed. "Martinez, can you and your people make it to the north side of the village?" he asked, over the radio. "There's a small ravine there that might give you some cover." "Negative," came the reply. "We'd have to cross too much open ground. They'd cut us down before we made it halfway." Marcus looked at the burning wreckage around him and made a decision that would later be called either brilliant or insane, depending on who was telling the story. The helicopter's fuel tanks had ruptured, creating a large pool of aviation fuel that was slowly spreading across the landing zone. More importantly, the aircraft's emergency flare system was still intact. "Chen, can you create a distraction for about 30 seconds?" Marcus asked, already moving toward the flare dispenser mounted near what had been the helicopter's tail. "What kind of distraction?" Chen replied, but he was already shifting his position to get a better angle on the enemy positions. "Just keep them busy, and when I say run, you move as fast as you can on that broken leg." Marcus crawled to the flare system and began manually activating the emergency signal devices. Instead of firing them into the sky as intended, he aimed them at the pool of aviation fuel that surrounded their position. The first flare ignited the fuel with a whoosh that could be heard across the entire battlefield. Suddenly, the crash site was engulfed in flames that created a wall of fire between them and most of the enemy positions. The intense heat and thick, black smoke provided the cover they desperately needed, but it also meant they had to move immediately or be burned alive. "Run! Now!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Chen under his good arm and helping him toward the only gap in the flames. The heat was incredible, singing their hair and uniforms as they stumbled through the inferno. Lieutenant Martinez saw the flames and immediately understood Marcus's plan. "Move! Move! Move!" she shouted to her remaining team members. Using the smoke and confusion created by the fire, they began their own escape from their trapped position. The enemy fighters were thrown into disarray by the sudden wall of fire. Many had been advancing on the crash site when the fuel ignited, and several were caught in the flames. Others retreated to safer positions, temporarily losing their overwhelming numerical advantage as they regrouped and tried to understand what had happened. Marcus and Chen emerged from the flames on the far side of the landing zone, their uniforms smoking and their skin red from the heat but alive and mobile. The fire had bought them precious minutes, but the enemy would soon reorganize and resume their attack with even greater fury. Looking around the battlefield, Marcus could see that their situation remained desperate. They were still outnumbered, still low on ammunition, and now they had lost their only cover. But something had changed in the enemy's behavior. Instead of the confident advance they had maintained throughout the ambush, the fighters seemed more cautious, more uncertain. Marcus realized that the destruction of the helicopter and their escape from the flames had cost the enemy something they had not expected to lose: the element of surprise and psychological advantage. The Americans were supposed to have been easy targets, trapped and helpless. Instead, they had turned their greatest vulnerability into a weapon and were still fighting. As the smoke from the burning fuel began to clear, Marcus could see enemy fighters moving to surround their new position. The respite had been brief, but it had given them something invaluable: hope. They were still alive, still fighting, and the enemy had learned that killing them would not be as simple as they had expected. The flames from the burning helicopter fuel had created chaos across the battlefield, but Marcus knew the advantage would be temporary. As the smoke began to clear, he could see enemy fighters regrouping and moving to surround their position. What had started as an ambush was now becoming a siege, and the odds remained heavily against the American survivors. Lieutenant Martinez and her 2 remaining able-bodied soldiers had managed to reach a cluster of abandoned buildings on the edge of the village during the confusion. Corporal Williams was still alive but fading fast from blood loss, and they had no medical supplies to treat his wounds properly. The team was down to less than 2 magazines of ammunition between them. Marcus helped Sergeant Chen to a position behind a low stone wall that provided some cover from the enemy fire. Chen's broken leg was getting worse, the bone likely compound, fractured, but the veteran sergeant continued to scan for targets with his pistol ready. Years of combat had taught both men that giving up was not an option, even when the situation seemed hopeless. "Boss, I've been thinking," Chen said, his voice strained but determined. "These guys set up this ambush pretty well, but they made one mistake. They're all focused on us now, which means they're not watching their own backs." Marcus looked around the battlefield, considering Chen's words. The enemy had indeed committed most of their forces to the immediate area around the crash site, creating a concentration of fighters that might work to their disadvantage if exploited correctly. But exploiting it would require taking enormous risks with their already desperate situation. The radio crackled with Martinez's voice. "Marcus, we've got movement on all sides. Looks like they're preparing for a final assault. I count at least 60 fighters moving into position." Through his binoculars, Marcus could see what Martinez was describing. The enemy commander had decided to end the standoff with overwhelming force. Fighters were moving into assault positions from multiple directions, planning to advance simultaneously and crush the remaining resistance through sheer numbers. But as Marcus watched the enemy preparations, he noticed something that gave him an idea. The fighters were using a large building in the center of the village as their command post, with runners carrying messages back and forth between the building and the various assault groups. If that building could be neutralized, the coordinated attack might fall apart into confusion. "Martinez, do you still have any explosives?" Marcus asked over the radio. Jackson had 2 grenades, but he used one before he was killed. "We've got 1 fragmentation grenade left." One grenade was not enough to destroy a building, but it might be enough to create the disruption they needed. Marcus looked at the tactical situation again, mentally calculating distances and angles. There was a way to make this work, but it would require splitting their tiny force even further and taking risks that bordered on suicidal. "Chen, how good are you at creating distractions?" Marcus asked. "With a broken leg and a pistol?" "I can make some noise, but not for very long." Marcus outlined his plan quickly. It was desperate, probably impossible, and almost certainly a death sentence for whoever attempted it. But it was the only chance they had to turn the tables on their attackers and maybe, just maybe, survive long enough for rescue to arrive. The plan called for Chen to create a diversion on the south side of their position, drawing as many enemy fighters as possible toward his location. Meanwhile, Marcus would use the distraction to reach Martinez's position and then attempt to infiltrate the command building. If they could eliminate the enemy leadership and destroy their coordination, the attack might collapse into confusion. "That's the dumbest plan I've ever heard," Chen said after Marcus finished explaining. "When do we start?" Marcus checked his watch. The enemy assault groups were almost in position, which meant they had maybe 10 minutes before the final attack began. He gathered what remained of their ammunition and equipment, leaving most of it with Chen, who would need every advantage he could get to sell the diversion convincingly. "Give me 5 minutes to reach Martinez's position, then make as much noise as you can," Marcus said, preparing to move. "And Tommy, it's been an honor serving with you." "Save the speeches for when we get home, boss. You're not getting rid of me that easy." Marcus smiled grimly and began his movement across the battlefield, using the scattered debris and abandoned equipment to mask his approach. The enemy fighters were focused on their assault preparations and didn't notice one figure moving carefully through the shadows. He reached Martinez's position just as the sound of Chen's pistol began echoing across the village. The sergeant was firing single shots at regular intervals, making each round count while creating the impression of a larger force. The enemy immediately began concentrating more fighters toward the sound of gunfire. "What's the plan?" Martinez asked as Marcus slid into cover beside her. "We're going to hit their command post," Marcus explained quickly. "If we can disrupt their leadership, maybe we can turn this from an organized assault into a confused mob." Martinez looked at the heavily defended building in the center of the village. "That's suicide. There must be 20 fighters around that building." "Probably more," Marcus agreed. "But it's the only shot we have." Together, they began moving through the village, using the abandoned buildings and narrow alleys to mask their approach. Behind them, Chen continued his one-man holding action. Though the rate of fire was slowing as his ammunition ran low, the enemy was beginning to realize that the resistance was coming from only one position. Marcus and Martinez reached the edge of the central square, just as the enemy commander emerged from the building to observe the final preparations for the assault. He was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of a professional soldier, clearly the architect of the successful ambush that had brought down the helicopter. "That's him," Martinez whispered. "Take him out and the whole thing might fall apart." Marcus raised his pistol, lining up the shot carefully. At this range, with the stress and injuries he had sustained, it would be difficult to make a clean kill. But as he prepared to fire, the enemy commander turned and looked directly at him as if sensing the threat. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the square, professional soldiers who understood that only one of them would walk away from this confrontation. Then the commander shouted a warning to his men and dove for cover just as Marcus fired. Marcus's shot missed the enemy commander by inches, the bullet sparking off the concrete wall behind where the man had been standing. The missed opportunity sent a chill through both American soldiers as they realized their position was now compromised. Within seconds, enemy fighters were converging on their location from multiple directions. "We need to move now," Martinez hissed, grabbing Marcus by the arm and pulling him toward a narrow alley between two buildings. Behind them, automatic weapon fire began chewing up the ground where they had been positioned moments before. The alley was barely wide enough for one person, forcing them to move in single file through the maze of abandoned buildings. Marcus could hear the enemy fighters shouting commands as they organized a systematic search of the area. The element of surprise was gone, and now they were being hunted through unfamiliar terrain by an enemy that knew every street and building. As they reached the end of the alley, Martinez held up a hand signaling for Marcus to stop. Through a gap in the buildings, they could see at least 6 enemy fighters moving in a coordinated pattern, searching for them with military precision. These weren't untrained insurgents. They were professional soldiers with discipline and experience. "We're not going to make it to the command building," Martinez whispered. "There are too many of them, and they know we're here now." Marcus nodded, accepting the tactical reality of their situation, but he wasn't ready to give up entirely. "What about that water tower over there?" he asked, pointing to a tall concrete structure on the far side of the square. "If we can get up there, we might be able to spot their positions and maybe call in an airstrike if rescue ever comes." It was a long shot, but it was better than hiding in an alley waiting to be discovered. The water tower was about 200 yards away across open ground, but the enemy fighters seemed to be concentrating their search in the buildings around the square rather than watching the outer perimeter. Meanwhile, the sound of Chen's pistol had stopped echoing across the village. Either he had run out of ammunition or something worse had happened. The silence was ominous, suggesting that their diversion was no longer working and the enemy would soon realize how few Americans were actually still fighting. "On 3, Marcus said, preparing to sprint across the open ground toward the water tower. 1, 2. Before he could reach 3, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotor blades began echoing across the valley. Both Americans looked up in amazement as two attack helicopters appeared over the ridge, flying low and fast toward the village. The cavalry was arriving, but whether it would be in time remained to be seen. The enemy commander's voice could be heard shouting orders as his fighters scrambled to deal with the new threat. Anti-aircraft weapons that had been hidden throughout the village began emerging from concealment, turning the hunters into the hunted as the attack helicopters began their first strafing run. "Now!" Marcus shouted, and both soldiers sprinted across the open ground toward the water tower. The enemy fighters were too busy taking cover from the helicopter attack to notice two figures running across the square. They reached the base of the water tower just as the first helicopter unleashed its rockets on the command building. The explosion was tremendous, sending chunks of concrete and debris flying across the entire village center. Through the smoke and dust, Marcus could see enemy fighters scattered and disorganized, their careful ambush plans destroyed by the arrival of reinforcements. Marcus and Martinez climbed the rusty ladder on the side of the water tower as quickly as possible, their hands slipping on the metal rungs but driven by the need to reach a defensible position. Below them, the battle had turned into chaos, as the attack helicopters systematically destroyed enemy positions while the surviving fighters tried to retreat or fight back. From the top of the water tower, they had a commanding view of the entire battlefield. Marcus could see Sergeant Chen's position, where the brave soldier was still alive and waving at the helicopters to identify his location. The enemy forces were in complete disarray, with many fighters abandoning their weapons and fleeing toward the mountains. But the victory came with a price. As Marcus watched through his binoculars, he could see that one of the attack helicopters had taken damage from ground fire and was struggling to maintain altitude. Black smoke was trailing from its engine, and the pilot was clearly fighting to keep the aircraft airborne. "Dragon 2, this is ground team," Marcus called over his radio, finally able to establish communication with the rescue force. "We have survivors at the water tower and one more at the crash site. Be advised, enemy still has anti-aircraft capabilities in the village." The response crackled back immediately. "Ground team, this is Dragon Leader. We see your position. Maintain cover while we clear the remaining hostiles. Medical evacuation is inbound." The second phase of the battle lasted another 20 minutes. As the attack helicopters systematically hunted down the remaining enemy fighters, Marcus watched with professional appreciation as the pilots used their superior firepower and mobility to turn what had been an enemy stronghold into a killing field. The enemy commander who had orchestrated the ambush made one final attempt to rally his forces, appearing briefly in the square with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, but his luck had run out. One of the helicopter pilots spotted him and eliminated the threat with a burst of cannon fire that ended the resistance permanently. As the medical evacuation helicopter touched down near the water tower, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. They had survived an impossible situation through a combination of skill, courage, and pure stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Sergeant Chen was loaded onto the helicopter first, his broken leg requiring immediate medical attention, but his spirits still high despite everything he had endured. Lieutenant Martinez helped load the wounded Corporal Williams, who had somehow survived his blood loss long enough to see rescue arrive. Marcus was the last to board the evacuation helicopter, taking one final look at the burning village where they had fought for their lives. The enemy had planned the perfect ambush using superior numbers and prepared positions to trap and destroy an American military unit. They had succeeded in shooting down the helicopter and trapping the crew and passengers, but they had failed to account for the determination and resourcefulness of professional soldiers who refused to give up. Marcus had walked away from a helicopter crash that should have killed him, survived an ambush by overwhelming enemy forces, and helped turn certain defeat into victory through courage and tactical thinking. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward base, Marcus closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of a job well done. The enemy had shot down his aircraft and trapped his people, but in the end, they were the ones who had paid the ultimate price for their aggression. 6 months after the helicopter crash, Captain Marcus Riley stood before a military tribunal in a sterile conference room, thousands of miles from the battlefield where he had nearly died. The investigation into the failed mission had been thorough, and intensive, with every decision analyzed and every action scrutinized by officers who had never faced enemy fire themselves. The official report lay open on the table before him, its pages filled with technical analysis of the helicopter's mechanical failure, ballistic reports on the enemy weapons used in the ambush, and detailed accounts of the tactical decisions made during the engagement. What the report could not capture was the fear, determination, and split-second choices that had kept 6 American soldiers alive when all odds were against them. "Captain Riley," the lead investigator began, "your decision to continue the mission despite signs that the intelligence might have been compromised resulted in the loss of a multi-million-dollar aircraft and nearly cost the lives of your entire team. How do you justify these actions?" Marcus had been expecting this question for months. The military loved to find someone to blame when operations went wrong, and as the mission commander, he was the obvious target. But he had prepared his answer carefully, drawing on 15 years of combat experience and the knowledge that his decisions had ultimately saved lives. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence we received was consistent with dozens of previous missions in the same region. There were no clear indicators that suggested an ambush of this magnitude. When the situation deteriorated, my primary responsibility was to my team and their safe recovery. Every decision I made was focused on that objective." The tribunal members exchanged glances before the lead investigator continued. "Your unauthorized use of the helicopter's emergency flare system to create a fire barrier was extremely dangerous and could have resulted in additional casualties. This action was not covered in any standard operating procedures." Marcus straightened in his chair, meeting the investigator's gaze directly. "Sir, standard operating procedures assume normal combat situations. When you're surrounded by 100 enemy fighters with no escape route and wounded men under your command, you adapt or you die. The flare system saved our lives and allowed us to break contact with the enemy." The second investigator, a colonel with multiple combat ribbons, leaned forward. "Captain, we've reviewed the after-action reports from Lieutenant Martinez and Sergeant Chen. Both speak very highly of your leadership under extreme circumstances. However, there remains the question of why you chose to remain in such a dangerous position instead of aborting the mission when you first suspected an ambush." It was a fair question, one that Marcus had asked himself countless times during his recovery. His shoulder had required surgery to repair the damage from the crash, and he still walked with a slight limp from injuries sustained during their escape from the burning helicopter. But the physical scars were nothing compared to the weight of command decisions that had put his people in danger. "Sir, abandoning the ground team was not an option. Lieutenant Martinez and her soldiers were counting on us for extraction. In my judgment, the risk to the aircraft was acceptable compared to the certainty that those soldiers would die if we left them behind." The tribunal continued for another hour, dissecting every aspect of the mission with the cold precision that only comes with hindsight and safety. Marcus answered each question honestly, defending his actions while acknowledging the mistakes that had been made. The loss of Corporal Jackson weighed heavily on him, though the investigation had concluded that the soldier's death was unavoidable given the circumstances. When the formal questioning ended, Marcus was dismissed while the tribunal deliberated. He walked out into the corridor where Sergeant Chen was waiting, still using a cane but otherwise recovered from his injuries. Tommy had been through his own investigation, though as crew chief his decisions were less scrutinized than those of the mission commander. "How'd it go in there?" Chen asked, though Marcus's expression probably told him everything he needed to know. "About what you'd expect. They want someone to blame for losing a helicopter and getting a soldier killed. That's bullshit, and they know it," Chen replied with the bluntness that had made him an excellent crew chief. "Every person who was on that bird is alive because of what you did. Jackson died fighting, and he saved lives doing it." 3 hours later, Marcus was called back into the tribunal room to hear their decision. The lead investigator's expression was unreadable as he announced the findings. "Captain Riley, this tribunal finds that while some of your tactical decisions were unorthodox and carried significant risk, they were made under extreme combat conditions with the primary goal of preserving American lives. You are hereby cleared of any criminal wrongdoing." Marcus felt a wave of relief, but the investigator wasn't finished. However, given the loss of aircraft and the tactical situation that developed, this tribunal recommends that you be reassigned to non-combat duties pending a complete review of mission planning procedures for this region. It was a compromise decision, neither fully condemning nor completely exonerating his actions. Marcus would keep his rank and career, but his days of flying combat missions were over. For a pilot who had lived for the thrill and responsibility of combat aviation, it felt like a death sentence. But as he left the tribunal room and walked out into the afternoon sunlight, Marcus realized that the real victory had nothing to do with official findings or career consequences. 6 months earlier, he had faced an impossible situation with the lives of his people hanging in the balance. Through courage, quick thinking, and a refusal to abandon his soldiers, he had brought them home alive. Lieutenant Martinez had recovered fully from her injuries and was back in the field leading other special operations missions. Sergeant Chen had returned to flight status and was training new crew chiefs in the lessons learned from their ordeal. Even Corporal Williams had survived his wounds and was serving in a training capacity while he completed his physical rehabilitation. The enemy commander who had planned the ambush was dead, along with most of his fighters. Intelligence reports indicated that the group responsible for the attack had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, their weapons caches captured or destroyed by follow-up operations. The ambush that was supposed to be their greatest victory had instead become their final defeat. Marcus drove home that evening to a small house near the base where he had been reassigned to train new pilots in survival and emergency procedures. It wasn't the career he had planned, but it was meaningful work that could help other airmen survive similar situations. On his kitchen table was a letter from the families of the soldiers he had helped rescue, thanking him for bringing their loved ones home. As he sat down to write his own letter to Corporal Jackson's widow, Marcus reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He had joined the military to serve his country and test himself against the ultimate challenges of combat. The enemy had shot down his helicopter and tried to kill him and his team, but in the end, they had failed in their most important objective. The men who had planned the perfect ambush were dead, while Marcus Riley was alive, still serving his country and still making a difference in the lives of other soldiers. They had shattered his helicopter and wounded his body, but they had not broken his spirit or ended his service. In the final accounting, that was the only victory that truly mattered. He walked away from that crashed helicopter, survived impossible odds, and made his enemies pay the ultimate price for their aggression. The official reports would argue about tactics and procedures, but the simple truth remained. When faced with overwhelming force and certain death, he had refused to surrender and had brought his people home alive. That was the real story. The one that would be remembered long after the bureaucratic findings were forgotten in some military filing cabinet. Marcus Riley had proven that courage, determination, and leadership could overcome any odds, no matter how desperate the situation appeared.